take a minute to again remind ourselves of the obvious fact that I did not create myself. And that whatever I usually call myself, in my case Ravi, will be here only for a few decades. And also that I did not create this breathing apparatus, and that I am being kept alive by the breath of the divine energy. These simple facts, which nobody can disagree with, if I can return to this occasionally, it will very much change my whole attitude to myself and to other people and to the whole planet. Before proceeding today about the spiritual similarities in the two great traditions, or two, more or less the two classical divisions that I have tried to make, because within each of these large divisions there is a lot of variation. The Abrahamic tradition and the Indian tradition, or the Western or the Eastern, different labels get attached. But before that, I just want to spend a few more minutes on the whole notion of original sin that we spoke about yesterday, in which the notion, which is very strongly emphasized, especially in Roman Catholicism more so than elsewhere, that just from the very birth, each one of us is condemned to be sinful, is sinful precisely because we are born of Adam and Eve, and they had committed sin by disobeying the will of God. And they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. If you look at it fairly seriously, I sometimes have wondered whether they are being expelled from the Garden of Eden or they are being graduated. Should Adam and Eve be just lying around under the apple tree, holding hands all the day, all the time? Is that their function? Is that the requirement from the church point of view? No action is required. They have been asked to go out in the world and undertake action. Here it might also interest you, some of you may know some people of Japanese origin, their attitude to action is very different. And here I actually had an exchange a long time ago with Roshi Kabori, highly exalted Zen master. He was actually head of Rinzai Zen for decades. And actually the reason for that conversation was, maybe if you don't mind my giving a slight background to this, a very well-known bank manager in India who was manager of a large State Bank of India branch in Delhi. But because he was a good manager, so he was appointed as a manager. State Bank of India also has some banks in Japan. So he was appointed there in Kyoto as head of that bank. And I happened to run into him. I was visiting actually Roshi Kabori and just ran into him. And he said, you know, he's very happy to be honored and given more money, etc., but I have only one regret. He says, in India, the bank would start at 9 o'clock, but being a manager, I will go there at about 10 o'clock and ask for tea. This is very Indian. And then About lunch is supposed to be about 12:30, but about 11:30 we would wonder where we might go for lunch. And then the bank continues until 5 o'clock, but I could go home at 4. But the trouble is, here in Japan, the starting time is 9 o'clock, but the workers show up at 8:30. And then they continue working even past 5 o'clock closing time. He says, the trouble is here, I don't know what to do. I have to come much earlier than I would have done in India, and I have to stay much longer. So I was just speaking about it to Roshi Kabori, and this is what he made this remark, that in Japan, undertaking action is supposed to be expressing one's real self. They're not waiting for holidays. And he was especially then remarking on it, that coming from this whole notion of from being expelled from the Garden of Eden and going out and doing some action or some work is regarded as a punishment in the Western world. So people are just waiting for weekends or for holidays, as if that's the more desirable part. Actual working is somehow a punishment. So think about this whole notion of original sin quite seriously. Is the suggestion really, just because we are expected to undertake some action, is that undesirable? Just hanging around in the Garden of Eden, lying around? Will that be the more desirable feature? Okay. Let me now really move towards what is deeply common among the real searchers or real experiencers in both of these traditions. Not necessarily what gets proclaimed in the churches or elsewhere, but people who are actually undertaking spiritual search. And among those common things is, first of all, a very strong notion that the very purpose of our existence is to find our oneness with the One. That is the overall call. And I have already mentioned that particularly in the Indian tradition, very strong emphasis on this, the 4 so-called great enunciations or the Mahavakyas, I am Brahma, etc. I don't need to repeat those now here. But this is also there in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I will just give you some examples of that. Christ's own remark, the Father and I are one. It may not be acceptable from the liturgical or clerical point of view, but it can hardly be denied for himself. And then several of the sages within the Christian tradition have continued with this. But always this suggestion that this ultimate reality, of course some labels get attached to it, but Godhead, Brahma, Allah, God, something or the other, or sometimes just simply the absolute or that. As if this really remains constantly inexpressible. And the strong suggestion, particularly in medieval Christian theology, that this is totaliter eliter, wholly other. It just cannot be expressed. And in the Upanishads, very strong expression about neti neti, not this, not this. But having said that, nevertheless, the call is that we may not be able to describe this. Even the Buddha cannot describe what nirvana is. Still, that doesn't mean that one should not undertake the effort required to relate with the One, and that this One is, in a way, maybe indescribable, but it is intimately within ourselves. That's very much the call. And here is actually a remark of Christ, but of course not in the canonical Gospels. It's in the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas. And here I will actually read this to you. Christ said, the kingdom is inside you. Actually, I know this by heart. I can mention this. The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. if you would know God, you must know yourself. You know yourself, you will be the Father. In fact, you are poverty. Very strong statement about study, self-knowledge, which you cannot find in any of the canonical Gospels, sadly. But also emphasizing that we are the children of the living Father, not only Christ. And then we have these classical expressions. I will quote a few of them to you. For example, the remark of St. Paul. By the way, especially theosophical people would know that according to HPB, St. Paul was a real initiate. She was not a great fan of the church, as probably most of you know. and the church was not a great fan of hers either. It was mutual disrespect. Nevertheless, she was a great admirer of St. Paul. You can find this in her writings. And St. Paul's remark, I am crucified to the world, yet I live, but not I, but Christ lives in me. What does that mean? His identification with Christ. Then we have a remark of Meister Eckhart. Every Christian to the Word. Give birth to the Word, meaning to God, to Christ. Because in the opening lines in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It's sort of repeated twice in a slightly different way. So, by the way, which is being translated as the Word in the Greek origin is logos, which also means intelligence. It means spirit, but for whatever reason, it got at one stage translated as the Word, so that gets repeatedly translated. But it has several other meanings. And then another 18th century Dutch Christian mystic, Angelus Silesius, this is his remark. Christ may be born 1,000 times in Galilee, all in vain, unless he is born in me. So, very strong emphasis that what is required is to, if you like, give birth to the Word or to have the Christ born in me, which is another way of saying to be born, to have a spiritual birth and to find one's oneness or unity with God. But it might actually be helpful to just read to you a remark of Christ himself. This is in the Gospel of John, first chapter, the very first chapter, verses 9 to 13. First of all, that was the true light which gives light to every man coming into the world. This is speaking about the birth of the Word. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. To those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. This is the very purpose of his coming here, to give that kind of possibility to others. But as you said here, he came to his own, but they did not recognize him, or they did not receive him. Then the other remark that I partly made the other day also, so much emphasis on oneness of everything in the Indian context and on the uniqueness of everything in the Abrahamic context. And it seems to me rather obvious that it is not a good idea to dismiss half the sages of the world, unless you are a missionary, then of course, obviously the other guys are wrong, right? Because they don't see the truth. But if you are a searcher, then to have more than one expression of truth can actually be very helpful. Here I give you an example from the history of physics that might engage some of you. Especially in the 1920s to 1930, or approximately that time, there was great crisis in physics. Because very elementary particles, sometimes they behaved like waves and sometimes they behaved like particles. And the crisis was, what are they? Is ultimate reality closer to particles or to the waves? Because in some experiments, as I said, they behave like particles, and some other experiments are like waves. And then it used to be a kind of a standard remark in many of the scientific laboratories that on Monday, Wednesday, Friday they were particles, on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday they were waves, and on Sunday the Lord rested. But then the resolution of that was, actually coming from quantum mechanics, suggesting that they were neither particles nor waves, but the ultimate reality from which they originate can't, strictly speaking, be defined, but we have to measure it. So when we conduct experiment, depending on the nature of the experiment, they sometimes show as waves or sometimes as particles. So their demonstration of their actuality depends on the apparatus or on the experimental setup. So I suggest to you that neither the creation myth nor the emanation myth is wholly true. They are both depending on the cultural setup in which they get manifested one way or the other way. That what we need to come back to something that actually is repeatedly said by all the sages, that the ultimate reality cannot be described. I started that today, just finishing saying this, neti neti. It cannot be described, but sooner or later something gets said. And then the philosophers and the theologians take it on, and then all hell breaks loose after that. They have to keep arguing with each other, keep elaborating this more and more one way or the other. Whatever they believe in has to be justified more and more rigorously. But always the suggestion is that no form, whether it is philosophical or music or sculpture, nothing can really capture the ultimate reality. But certainly none of the traditions are against any of these attempts to try to say something, to try to indicate something, to call people to something. They're not against music, they're not against philosophy or theology or anything like this. But always saying again and again that all of these have limitations and that they cannot actually describe or bring one to the ultimate. So then really the freedom will come unless, as I said, you have a missionary attitude, then obviously the other guys are clearly wrong. It just shows, obviously, that they just don't understand what is true. Christian missionaries have been very clever about this, trying to promote this idea more than any other, everywhere, trying to show how bad Hinduism is, how Buddhism doesn't believe in anything, ultimate reality, etc. If you want examples of this, for your sake, I can provide you that. Would you like some of those examples?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you know, the Hindus are just worshipping cows. Obviously, they are at that animal level, right? But in any case, my suggestion to you is to not get so convinced that the truth has been expressed in one language and not in the other. That taking this example from history of physics, to realize that the inexpressible reality Still, people attempt to express this, to demonstrate this some way or the other, but that the mode of expression, or in physics we would say the experimental setup, here cultural setups, therefore create slightly different kind of language, different kind of understanding of this. Which is why the emphasis very much, I'm suggesting to you, not to get stuck on one expression or the other. From a searcher's point of view, it can free one from the expression of truth and to actually search for the truth. Or another way, at the very best, any teaching or any tradition is like a finger pointing to the moon of truth. If you get so attached to the finger, you will never get to the moon. In fact, if you look at any of the serious searchers in any tradition, in India or in the Abrahamic tradition, they somehow go beyond the traditional remarks. I yesterday had quoted something from Eckhart, not getting wholly satisfied with any description or any reference to God, so for suggesting Godhead, which is, as he says, 100 times subtler than God. Therefore, of course, he's excommunicated. That's the churchly affair. But one would realize, on the other hand, every tradition, seriously speaking, succeeds when it can free a searcher from the tradition. Which is why I had quoted to you a remark of Shankara yesterday or day before yesterday, that for those who are awakened, Scripture stops being authoritative. Scripture is representing the tradition. It's no longer authoritative. And I had quoted a similar remark from the Bhagavad Gita even, which itself is a scripture, speaking about being freedom from the scriptures. They are specifically speaking about scriptures there simply because words are being used and scriptures are expressed in words. Otherwise, of course, they might be expressed in music, in sculpture, but those are very harder for the scholars to argue about. So they need some words to argue. This is the reason. So one ends up having written material as the source of argumentation. And then one also needs to realize what is the overall purpose of spiritual search. I especially say this because there are endless arguments between so-called science and religion, blah, blah, blah. They have nothing to do with each other. Science is interested in finding ultimately one equation that can express all external reality. Spiritual people are not against knowledge. They can't possibly be against any of this. Their interest is not getting more and more knowledge about anything. Their interest is to enhance the quality of their being. The whole enterprise of any spiritual search is to enhance the quality of one's being. In fact, Krishna, I already mentioned this in the 13th chapter when he describes what is right knowledge or true knowledge. He simply describes the quality of the knower. Then he says, this is true knowledge, the rest is all ignorance. Unless this knowledge changes the quality of the knower, it is not the true knowledge from a spiritual point of view. You can have all kinds of notions. E could be equal to mc square or mc cube. What difference would it make to the quality of anybody's being? But as Krishnamurti also occasionally actually spoke about it, he used to call it the religious mind. In fact, I remember once saying to him, usually these days, to say somebody has a religious mind is really to say he's bigoted, narrow mind. That's what has become the meaning of the word. So I said, why don't you use the word something like spiritual mind that is not yet spoiled completely. It will be spoiled sooner or later. He said, just because people are fools doesn't mean that I should not use the right expression. So he almost always called to the religious mind. Don't you agree with me? Yeah. So from his point of view, religious mind is really free of all this kind of knowing this and that. But he's not against knowledge. That would be completely surprising. No spiritually oriented person is against any kind of knowledge. On the other hand, that is not their main concern. The only kind of knowledge they wish for is that will affect the quality of their being. And that is the call, that is the search. So one needs to be very clear about it. All this science religion kind of argument have nothing to do with these two enterprises. Quality of being of a scientist is irrelevant for doing science. I can assure you, I have personally been fortunate. I have met at least a dozen Nobel Prize winners, mostly in physics because of my own background. Some of them you would not want to invite home for tea. Some quite remarkable people, very remarkable human beings. Particularly two people I can specially mention. Freeman Dyson, who inherited the chair of Einstein in the Institute for Advanced Study. He had visited me at my home and even ended up washing the diapers of my daughter. I don't want to go into the details of these stories. No, there are some very remarkable human beings. But on the other hand, let me assure you, quality of the being of a scientist has nothing to do. Of course, they have to have smart minds, that is true. But that doesn't define the quality of a being of a person. That has nothing to do with the quality of their scientific research. They can be dogmatic, they can be against almost every other human being. If you especially wanted one or two examples of this, I could give you privately, because it's not a good idea for me to be denigrating these scientists. But take my word for it, that the two enterprises have completely different intention, different purpose. Spiritual search and scientific research have very different projects. In fact, the Theosophical Society of America has invited me to give 4 talks on it in June, 4 Saturdays in June. I'll be speaking exactly on this topic, so you're welcome to join it on Zoom if you like. So the project here in the spiritual search really is the enhancement of the quality of one's being. And for that, everywhere suggestions, first of all, really deep down common suggestion, how to be free of me. Freedom from selfishness. I have already more than once quoted to you the remark of Christ, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. This is in the Gospel of Matthew. In other Gospels, the same thing is actually expressed even more strongly. Unless you die to yourself, unless you die to the world. Varieties of ways of saying it. And Christ, but he's not against the world, let me remind you. For example, one of the remarks of Christ is, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But also a reminder, again a remark of Christ, my kingdom is not of this world. Anybody who has read any of the Gospels would recognize immediately what I'm saying. This is not anything that I'm making up. We have an examiner here. He always checks what I say, so he can tell you. So none of these serious spiritual searches are against scientific knowledge or against doing something in the world, etc. But their project is to how can I enhance the quality of my being so that I can come closer and closer to the quality of God. Compassion, love, truth, sense of service, those are the kind of description that are given. Which is why the emphasis again and again, at least in my hearing or reading, much more described by Krishnamurti than by anybody else, not even intentionally trying to do good. I think I quoted this earlier to you. This is actually a report given by Laura Huxley. This was not in my own experience with him. Laura Huxley had once had a few of her friends were meeting together one evening for dinner, Krishnamurti was among them. And they were apparently speaking how they were going around doing good. So Krishnamurti intervened. He says, you should not be going around doing good. So they said, but that's what you do. You're going around the world every year doing good. He says, not intentionally. That's her report, not my report. But because according to Krishnamurti, if you have good in you, it will ooze out of you. You don't decide to do good. To say that the Buddha was enlightened but not compassionate would be an oxymoron. To say that Christ was Son of God but not love did not ooze out of him, that would also be an oxymoron. Every expression of Christ, every commandment of Christ contains the word love in it. No other religious literature anywhere, in India or anywhere, can possibly show that. So one needs to see that these people are not deciding to be compassionate or deciding to be loving, but because of the quality of their being, these kind of attributes ooze out of them. Or the example that Krishnamurti actually gave more than once in my hearing, a rose does not decide to smell like a rose. We recognize a rose because of its fragrance. That was a specific example I gave. And therefore, more and more emphasis, partly coming from this overall idea, how to become more and more free of my will, my project, my undertaking, my determination, etc. And in the Bhagavad Gita, very strong emphasis on describing the quality of a true yogi. On a Sanskrit word is nashkarmaya, which is literally, it simply means actionlessness. Or one might even, these are slightly possible translations, not from a language point of view, but from a thinking point of view. Action without the actor is a possibility. But literally, it simply means actionlessness. And that is the call. In fact, a description given by him of an advanced yogi sees that I do nothing at all. It's all being done through me or even by me, but not because of my initiative or my will. It is the will of God or will of Krishna that is acting through me. But again and again, Krishna says, Nashkarmya is not inaction. In fact, he says, nobody could survive even for a few hours without some action. Survival requires some action. I should tell you, as a kid, when I was about, I think, 10 years or 11 years old, I would often hear, in our family, there was always this kind of exchange going on about something or the other, about Bhagavad Gita or something, especially quoting Kabir, poet. He was very favorite poet of my father. And when I heard these people, I said, well, if Nashkarma is a good thing, why don't we just stop acting? So I decided to go lie down on a bed that I won't act. I'm following Krishna's advice. So after about 3 or 4 hours, I was feeling hungry. So I had to get up. And my mother said, no, you said no action. Go lie down. So then I had to learn something slightly differently, right? So Krishna actually says Nashkarma does not mean inaction. Nobody can survive without some action. In fact, he gives his own example. He says, I have nothing to gain, but if I were to stop acting, these worlds will perish. This is Krishna's remark in the Bhagavad Gita. So he says, therefore, I constantly undertake action. But the call for Nashkarmya is the action being originated for my gain, for my advancement, or am I becoming an instrument of Krishna's will? This requires more and more freedom from me, as I have been emphasizing again and again in the whole spiritual search. And here you see absolutely classical example from the remarks of Christ. I am not the author of the words I say. I say what my Father in heaven tells me to say. This is a direct quote from John's Gospel. I do nothing on my own. I follow what the Father wants me to do. But even then, of course, in the Christian theology or for the Christian, it gets attributed to Christ, always forgetting that he so completely emptied himself of his own will. Repeatedly, he makes this kind of remark, but as if it's Jesus who is doing this thing, that becomes emphasized in that form. I don't know whether everybody was here yesterday when I made a general remark that his name that's called Jesus in English, it comes from the Hebrew Joshua, prior to that Yehoshua, which is to say Yahweh works, or Yahweh. It's really, let me see how would I translate this. Yehoshua is it comes from the word Yahweh, which comes for the first time in the Bible in the book of Exodus. It's in the 3rd chapter, 14th verse, if you're interested, where Moses he hears this voice, go tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. And as you know, Moses had killed an Egyptian soldier. If he goes back, he'll be arrested and possibly killed. So he obviously is not eager to go back to the Pharaoh to tell him to say anything. So he says, who should I say has sent me? This is the first time the word Yahweh is used in the Bible. And the expression is, I am has sent you. Go tell the Pharaoh, I am sent you. But then sometimes, because in English it doesn't make that much sense, they add some other words like, I am who I am. This is not in the original. The original simply is, go tell the Pharaoh that I am has sent you. So the word Yehoshua really is, when it is said in the Bible, reporting Christ, I am the way, the truth, and the life, it really needs to be translated as, I am is the way, the truth, and the life, which would be saying Yahweh is the way, the truth, and the life. But scholars can obviously keep arguing about that as well, but it doesn't make sense from a purely churchly point of view. And therefore, the call again and again, as I just finished saying, really is to come to this attitude of Nash Karmaya. That doesn't mean not engaging in action, but the action being engaged in is not being driven by my aggrandizement or my achievement, but corresponding to the will of whatever we call it. In the Bhagavad Gita, naturally one would then say the will of Krishna, but will of God or will of Christ, whatever speaks to you. And which is why the remark of Krishna here, actually I have another quote from Christ here. This is in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, also slightly in chapter 14. I do nothing of myself. I seek not mine own glory. I am not the source of the words I speak to you. It is the Father who dwells in me, doing his own work. And Krishna's remark, an advanced yogi or exalted yogi sees that I do nothing at all. And we have a very interesting remark in a great Chinese classic. A sage does nothing, but nothing is left undone. Sage does nothing, but nothing is left undone. Okay, let me continue with some of these things. And again, some of these things I have said in slightly different context earlier, but the very notion or the idea, according to all the spiritual teachings, that a particle of divinity takes on a body, I use the word body, including the mind, in order for it to evolve, as it were, back to the source, back to God. I think I mentioned this. According to spiritual teachings, the manifested universe has come about by involution, not by evolution, starting from the highest level of consciousness, then manifested at different levels of consciousness. The scientific perspective is completely the contrary to this. So then the call is that every level wishes and needs to evolve, as it were, to return to the source, to return to God. And therefore this particle of divinity takes on a body and a mind so that it can undertake the appropriate action in order to evolve. I think maybe I already quoted to you a remark of Ishwar Krishna, author of Sankhya Karika, a great school of philosophy in India. Spirit without the body is lame, body without the spirit is blind. Some of you may be interested in one article a long time ago. I had actually taken this remark, trying to contrast it with the remark of Einstein, which I quoted yesterday. Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. If you look at these two very carefully, you will see the whole different understanding of religion in these two remarks. That will give you a good example of the differences between the Abrahamic and the Indian traditions. Study these two remarks carefully. They sound very similar to each other on the surface. Okay, so then really very much the suggestion that I need to undertake the action, and this is the reason this divine particle has taken on this body. That is the meaning of the soul. And I often keep asking people, it is easy to say, it is a cliche in all religions that we have a soul. Look at yourself impartially. The whole purpose of the soul is to be searching for how do I evolve to the level of being of God. Do you find this in yourself? It's easy to claim that we have a soul. Gurdjieff in particular very strongly says this is a stupid idea that we have a soul, but we can develop a soul. Because as I gave the example the other day, a magnetic needle, its whole purpose is to point to the magnetic north. That is its sole function. But if there are other distracting magnets around, it cannot point to the magnetic north. This is the difficulty. We may have a soul. It's a good idea to assume that, because that allows one to search for it. But there are very distracting magnets which all our education, everything in the world is all engaged with how do I get more prestige, more money, better house, better car, how can my kids get to better school, better college. This is the whole project of everybody, including me. I'm not saying this is only for you people. This is true for everybody. And it begins from day one for a kid. In sort of approval, disapproval is started right away from it. If they smile at you, give them another candy. So the whole search for approval, disapproval begins absolutely from day one for every kid. And all our education is oriented to this. So therefore, the notion that this soul is being developed in its search for connecting with the ultimate reality, it's a good idea. My favorite philosopher, Plotinus, actually makes this remark: our soul is amphibious in nature. It can sink completely into matter, or it can soar into the one. That's his remark in his classic text, Enneads. So ask yourself impartially, do I have a soul? As I said, it's actually helpful to begin with that assumption and then to see how do I nourish it, rather than to already, if one doesn't even have a particle that even wishes to be nourished. Partly I say that because in the whole field of alchemy, if you people are interested in these things, very strong suggestion dealing with whole alchemical project is dealing with inner transformation, although it gets externalized in terms of trying to convert lead into gold. If you have serious undertaking study of alchemical texts, the whole thing has to do with human transformation. But a very strong suggestion there that unless there is at least a little bit of gold, there is no possibility of lead turning into gold. And Christ makes a similar remark in a very different language. Unless one is called by the Father, one cannot be a disciple of mine. So trying to convey much the same, but in a slightly different language. Unless one already has some slight gold, not much possibility of turning this lead into gold. That's the more alchemical way of saying it. And then again and again, I've been emphasizing not to dismiss one expression or the other expression, particularly a very helpful remark actually of the Buddha. It is not wise for a person to think that we alone have the truth, the others don't. Very helpful remark of Buddha. It's not wise for a person to think that we alone have the truth. Let me see if I can. So in my judgment, it is really both helpful, not only ordinarily generous, compassionate, but actually from a searching point of view, very helpful to have more than one expression of truth, because that can free one from the expression and to search for truth. And then, of course, the question really is, how do we know different sounding expressions really are referring to the same thing? For example, Christ remarked, the Father and I are one. Personally, I have never heard anybody in India, although Krishna actually at one stage in the Bhagavad Gita says, I am the Father as well as the Mother, etc., the whole universe. But in general, God is rarely referred to as the Father in the Indian tradition. So to say I am Brahma and to say the Father and I are one, are they referring to the same? How do I know? Therefore, one has to really see here, where does that impression come in me? Why would I either say they are completely different, these two are different religions, they are talking about different things, you Hindus have no knowledge of any damn thing, only the Christians have the avenue to truth, etc., or vice versa. Or internally one feels that likely they are referring or pointing to the same truth. But personally for me, I don't know this. And in fact, as far as I can see, I can never know this until I can actually experience that closeness to it. But we have had one person in the human history that at least I have heard about, Ramakrishna, at the end of the 19th century, who actually undertook the practice both of Islam as well as of Christianity. But of course, he was coming from what we would call a Hindu background. Hindu, nobody knows what a Hindu background is, but and he concluded from his experience that ultimately one comes to the same divine experience. Personally, for me, as I said, I may not know this from my own experience, but that much more resonates for me as a truth. Because of my overall feeling, conviction, meeting people from many places who are equally good and also equally bad as I am. Everywhere we have had very wise people and very great scoundrels in every culture, every country. So for me, it actually makes sense to me overall that great sages in any tradition are likely coming to a very great common truth. But this is coming from my overall impression as I look around in the world. People may say, oh, the Hindu. I remember Gandhi actually defining, he was struck, somebody defined that Hindu is one who is searching for truth. And Gandhi was very struck by this. He said, well, that's a good definition of Hinduism. I can assure you, I have met thousands or actually millions of Hindus. I don't know many who are searching for any truth of any kind. It's easy to use these expressions. Similarly, the Christians are, of course, all being driven by the teaching of Christ. I would be very happy to meet one or two of them among the billions who live on the planet. This is the tragedy. I think therefore, I cannot personally say that these two expressions are leading to the same, but to me, it actually makes much more sense that every human being, somewhere or the other, doesn't matter which culture they are in, at what time in history they are in, some people are searching for something true. Naturally, depending on their language background and how they describe something, their expressions are bound to be different. This is nothing surprising to me. So different expressions don't need to therefore mean that they are not referring to the same reality. But the only one person that at least I have heard of who actually experienced this was Ramakrishna. Then I should also remind you people that several highly regarded people in the Indian tradition, now this is of course in contemporary times, until people don't often realize that until the Second World War almost, there was not that much international travel or international communication as it accelerated after that. Of course, even before that, there were some people going, Vasco da Gama going somewhere or the other, many people traveling centuries earlier, but not so many people traveling. So nowadays, so some of these examples I will give are really, in a way, coming from the modern days here, who are of Indian origin, but very deeply influenced by the Western teachings or Western tradition. For example, Vivekananda. He had come to USA in the Parliament of World Religions. Some of you probably know that. In 1893, there was a Parliament of World Religion in Chicago. Catholic Church refused to participate in it because how can there be any other religion? Take my word for it. You can read history, if you like. Actually, that parliament was very much supported by the Theosophical Society. They were trying to help, very much trying to organize that. And then, this might also interest you people. If you look at the Catholic Encyclopedia of Religion, dated about 1900 or maybe 1905, approximately that, there is an entry, just a few words about Buddhism, and then saying it is highly unlikely that in a quarter of a century there will be any more Buddhists left anywhere in the world. Take my word. You can look at that encyclopedia. I think it's good. This is where information can help you. Generally, I'm not supporting much more education, much more information. Then in 1993, there was a 100th anniversary of the World's Parliament of Religion. Again, very much supported by the Theosophical Society, actually. Again, held in Chicago. Radha Barney had specially invited me to present a paper there. That's the reason I'm... So there, I was so surprised. There were many more presentations in the Buddhist context than in the context of any other religion. And in fact, the Dalai Lama was the main speaker, and there was no room in any hotel which could have enough places in it for the audience. So they had to everything had to be arranged outside. Large places where the Dalai Lama was giving a talk, and some of these fundamentalist Christians were going around saying, oh, he should go to hell, etc. Slogans going around all the time, throughout his talk. That's what's going on in the name of Christianity, sir. You should be aware of this. So the encyclopedia about almost 90 years earlier was saying there will be hardly any Buddhists in 10 or 15 years. And now there were, as I said, more Buddhists present. I don't know whether they were Buddhists, but more Buddhist talks were being given or being listened to than any other religious talks there. This is really ironic to see what people's attitudes are to other religions here. So, but in any case, I just mentioned Vivekananda had given his talk in this 1893, and after that he stayed in USA for a little while, and I was very struck by the attitude, especially of service. So even to his fellow monks in the Ramakrishna mission, he very much advised them that it is all very fine for you people to sit around doing meditation unless you do some service for the poor. This is not true spirituality. So he very much tried to actually incorporate some of the understanding coming from the Christian tradition. And Raman, we call him Raman Maharishi, which literally means the great sage. Maharishi simply means the great sage. That's the expression in Sanskrit. And this is not his name. As Raman, as far as I know, the only book he actually read was the Bible. Take my word for it. Sir, I know you people are always surprised by these obvious facts. But you can check. and then Aurobindo, he was educated in England, highly educated, in fact, translated several Greek texts into English. And when he went to India, he had to learn his mother tongue, which he did not remember, Bengali, and later on learn Sanskrit. And of course, the British imprisoned him because he was interested in the freedom of India. And somehow he escaped and went to Pondicherry, which was under the French rule at that time. So he developed his ashram in Pondicherry, etc. But I give this example, he was very much influenced by the Western tradition as well. Therefore, very critical of Shankara, who repeatedly I have quoted to you this remark of his, very famous remark, Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya. Only Brahma is true, the whole manifested universe is false or unreal. Aurobindo very much wanted to, his whole emphasis was, if I were to use just a few words of his, was to spiritualize the material world rather than to dismiss the material world, to spiritualize the material world. And so I'm just giving you some of these examples, Vivekananda, Ramana, Aurobindo. On the other hand, similarly, some of the well-known Western people have been very much influenced by the Indian tradition. Just to remind you, Annie Besant and Alcott actually became Buddhists. And Annie Besant seems to have learned more Sanskrit than almost any Indian scholar that I know. She translated, for example, her translation of the Bhagavad Gita is one of my favorite translations, actually. So, by the way, I was asked to provide, because they were now Quest Book wanted to publish the slightly more American version rather than the English version. So they asked me to provide some American words of the English translation of Annie Besant translation. In any case, but then some of you may know the name of Krishna Prem. His real name was Ronald Nixon. He had gone to India and was very struck and became a great sage there. He's the one who started the so-called Mirtola ashram, a highly regarded sage, actually. I'm a great fan of his. And then his successor at Mirtola was Madhava Ashish, who was Scottish in origin. Went to India, he also became a saint there. And Madhava Ashish, I highly recommend to you a book of his called, I think it's called Man and, what is it?
Man, Son of Man.
Man, Son of Man.
Krishna Prem, man, measure of all things.
Yes.
And Krishna Prem, the Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yoga of the
It's a
Bhagavad Gita.
beautiful book.
Yeah. So I highly recommend both of these characters. And then some of you know Lama Govind, perhaps his name. He was of German and Latin American origin, went to Sri Lanka, was very struck by Buddhism. Later on, he moved to India. I was myself very fortunate to actually spend some time with him in 1965 in India. Remarkable sages, but they are coming from the Western world. Similarly, and then even Thomas Merton, some of you would know his name. In fact, there is a underlying rumor that he was poisoned by the Roman Catholic Church because of his interest in Zen Buddhism. But I don't know whether this is true. Nobody has verified this. But he was killed in Hong Kong or somewhere on.
Not by poison, it was electrocuted.
Electrocuted?
By something plugged in.
Yeah. In any case, all I'm saying is that increasingly many quite educated, but educated not in the usual sense, but spiritually interested people, both in the Eastern world, have been influenced by the Western traditions, and in the Western world, influenced by the Eastern traditions. This doesn't surprise me at all, because obviously one would realize, again and again I keep saying this, that there are different expressions, different ways of saying something true, not to get so attached to the expression, but to see what is behind that, what is required from us, what is the call. So I should, there is always many things more to say here, but I think given the time here, I hope that you folks will bring your own insights or your own understanding of some of these differences and how they can be or need to be reconciled. How do we go behind the expression or not get so stuck to the finger pointing to the moon? How to be free of the finger, but not to be against the fingers. They point to something true. Okay, let's take a minute and then we will just go and have some break. Please do bring any insights or different perspective or questions about something, whichever speaks to you. Somebody in the, Walter, please.
Can you understand me? Can you understand? Oh,
Yes.
can you understand? Then you're all right. Okay. It's not a question I have, Ravi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful series of lectures. It's come at the right time in the right form. And I'd like to share two quotes. Yesterday, you mentioned one quote by Einstein on creativity. I've got another one by him, which I find nice as well, and which shows both sides, the higher and the lower. At one time, he said, creativity is 20% inspiration and 80% transpiration. So this shows quite clearly that he needed the higher as well. I'd like to share a quote with you from my daily lectures of the Cloud of Unknown, which has been fascinating ever since you mentioned it the first time. It's like this. The access to heaven is through desire. He who longs to be there really is there in spirit. The path to heaven is measured by desire and not by minds. Love and desire constitute the life of the spirit, and the spirit abides where its love abides. We need not strain our spirit in all directions to reach heaven, for we dwell there already through love and desire. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that perspective. I think it's good to. We need both information and transformation. I think that's clearly helpful. If, for example, I had never read anywhere what Christ had said or what the Buddha had said, how would I come to some of these ideas? It is probably true that some people instinctively, maybe some of them really even from childhood, possibly depending based on their previous lives. For example, I have mentioned already here once that Shankara became actually a monastic at the age of 12. So for some people, the call for one side or the other is very deep-seated in them, even from possibly from previous lives, or like Mozart, for example, playing music, great music very early on in childhood. But not everybody is able to do this. Most people would have to study some music for some time to be able to play even. So there is certainly no need to feel against education or against information or anything like this. But the question really always arises from a spiritual side, whether our education or information is moving us more and more externally. By externally here, I really mean away from an inner search and inner transformation, or is it assisting it? But I don't believe that any teacher has ever suggested to be against education or information. Although many of them themselves are not so highly educated in the official sense of the expression. For example, Raman is a good example of this, whereas Vivekananda was fairly educated. So there are different. Aurobindo was very highly educated. So there are differences in the great sages' own background, but quality of their being doesn't wholly depend on what they have studied in college or university, but it's not against it.
Maybe just one more remark. You mentioned sin before. The brother of my grandmother was in China and in Japan, working for the Christian church, trying to convert people to Christianity. And at one meeting with my grandmother, the whole relatives, the whole group, he told us that the biggest problem for him is that Chinese and Japanese people just can't be convinced that there is sin and that they need a savior. That was his biggest problem. And of course, it made me laugh at that time, even as a child.
Yeah, but I think, don't you think it's a good idea that the Christians are convinced they are sinful, because we can all see that in them? You know?
Well, I grew up in a Protestant village surrounded by Catholic villages.
Yeah.
And of course, the Catholics, when German Fastnacht came, they all were on the road all the time and doing things they normally didn't do. And of course, after 1 week of going beyond everything, they repented. Our minister in the Protestant church told us, if I catch any one of you, in the neighboring villages, you won't get your confirmation. So there I realized also the big difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. We as Protestants always stand in front of the Last Judgment. And the Catholics could always go to their priest and repent and be freed of the sins for the moment.
Well, I wonder, do you want to respond to this? No? Now, if anybody else wishes to say something in response to what he is saying, or do you find it is more or less true in your own experience, or is it different?
It was hard to understand him, but I will say something about missionary. What you triggered for me this morning is that they don't see the truth. They make everybody else wrong. They don't understand what is true. And that's just like an eye-opener for me. So I'm like, oh, okay, I get it.
No, but it's very interesting if you look at the great sages themselves. For example, do you think Christ is trying to convert anybody? You read anything in the Bible. He is seen by some people around him as having something very remarkable, and they wish to learn something from him. He's not going around trying to convert them. Similarly, the Buddha. Well, as you probably all know, when the Buddha was enlightened, he wished to convey the teaching to somebody or the other, and in his judgment, the people who were prepared he earlier, during his search, had two great, well-known, if you might say, philosophy teachers or teachers. So he thought they will be able to understand what he's going to bring. But he soon discovered, because of him being able to see past the usual timing, that they had already passed away. Then he thought of his other fellow searchers who had been engaged in great ascetic practices with him. They were in a place called Sarnath. And there he thought maybe they are more or less prepared. So this is the famous walk of the Buddha from Bodh Gaya, where he was enlightened, to Sarnath. By the way, it goes very close to the Krishnamurti school at Rajghat. In fact, I have personally walked there with Krishnamurti exactly on that path, and I wanted my children to walk there so that they get some experience of the tradition, some connection with it. And then the moment his previously fellow ascetics see him coming, they say to each other, look, Siddhartha has found the truth. Just the way he's walking, they see it. So then they become his disciple. He's not trying to convert anybody. Christ is not trying to convert anybody. They see his wisdom, they see his compassion, They say his quality of being, so they wish to learn something from him, so they become his disciples. I actually say that again and again, that this whole notion of trying to convert somebody usually arises from one's own lack of understanding and a feeling that if others can more or less follow what I'm doing, maybe that's a good idea. It's a lack of conviction that what I'm doing is really worth doing. None of the, Raman Maharshi, do you think he was trying to convert anybody? Or Aurobindo or Vivekananda? None of them are interested in converting anybody. They wish to live in the right way, and those who see them or come close to them, they are struck by this. So I think this whole notion of the missionary business really arises, in my judgment anyway, from a lack of actual realization, actual practice inside. Thinking that if others can be convinced, maybe it's a good idea that it should be. But they are not. On the other hand, many of these people are teachers in the sense, some of them, for example, Krishnamurti was giving many public talks, etc., so that somebody would hear, and again, I would be completely surprised I have no idea, but I won't be surprised if maybe at least 100,000 people heard him among various talks. How many do you think are really now at the level of Krishnamurti? They really understood something or been transformed. I mean, it's not so easy to come to that kind of level. It would require an enormous amount of understanding, practice, complete freedom from my usual self. He repeatedly said, unless you die to everything you know, everything you possess, etc., you cannot understand what is true. Now, how many of us are willing to die to everything we know and everything we possess? I certainly see the difficulty in this myself, even to be temporarily free of that for a little while. So I think this whole notion of conversion, we need to understand what it is coming from. You look, any of the great teachers that are about whom we know anything, because they all can get very mythologized very soon. And so whether it is historically so or not, we don't know. But whatever anybody we know about, Kabir, a very great sage in India, he wasn't trying to convert anybody to anything. Guru Nanak was not trying to convert anybody to anything. So you look at any of the sages. Yes.
Yes, this reminds me of how important it is to give people space, give them the freedom to find on their own what's most important for them. The stories that you told earlier about individuals who have been given the Nobel Peace Prize and other gifts of appreciation, and yet were flawed in their personal lives, to me suggests that Spirit knows how to find a way through imperfect instruments, and in there, and that's the way we learn actually from each other and from nature, is looking for the gold in the denseness of each other's lives. So it's, I think, important to do what one is called to do what one, and little by little, the soul light begins to come through. The difficulty is recognizing it. You know, when I look at myself, it's what a tangle it is, this psyche, and looking for the glimmer of the voice of the soul is a difficult endeavor, and to be too preoccupied with that distracts me from the life that's calling me right every moment to be active in my life, not in anybody else's. So it's the journey is a difficult one.
No, that is true. This is one of the reasons why in practically every tradition, you would find that some people need to almost completely withdraw from the world, as it were, go to a monastery or something like this. And so that they can, as it were, engage more and more if whatever they understand by spiritual practice. But even there, now this might surprise some of you to learn, this was actually told to me by a Buddhist master in a monastery in Korea, that among the Buddhist monks in the monastery, no more than 12% actually engage in meditation. Because even, I was completely surprised by this, because even in a monastery, there are many things to be attended to, whether it is the garden or the kitchen or people are coming and visiting, etc. Partly because now there is not only ecotourism, but there is also sort of esotourism. You know, there are people who are looking for esoteric teachings, going to this place, that place. So, in fact, in some places, in some monasteries now, there is a strong tendency to have more or less at some level where tourists can come. They might even have a temple or a church there, some shrine. But their own more serious monks are further up the mountain, which they don't allow the tourists to go there. Partly because everything is becoming now more and more publicly approachable, and that usually doesn't mean that it helps the monks. It interferes with their practice of work, etc. But it is true, throughout human history, you would see many people just move away from the world altogether. But I'm not sure that in contemporary times that is the more recommended gesture or the recommended practice. Because, as you have in fact often said here, even in the gathering, that we need to do something in the world to assist the people to connect with something real. But it is so true that those who go to monastery sooner or later come out after they have come to. For example, the Buddha is a very good example of this. For several years, he was away from the kingdom or anything else. But after his enlightenment, he's now going around teaching, traveling. So all various different kind of things exist. If you look at many of the teachers, some of them probably never returned to the world, and we don't know very much about them, but some were enlightened or certainly exalted and then came back to the world to teach, etc. But some continued staying in the world. In fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, the only example of a great teacher that Krishna gives is of a king, Janak. So he's not against being the king of the ordinary world. That is also okay, it can help. And I am actually very struck by a remark of my own teacher, Jeanne de Salzman. She says, each one of us obviously, that seems very obvious, that there are large forces are at play. And that either we can all be just slaves of the large forces, or she says, unconscious slaves or conscious servants. Personally, I think conscious servant is very high. Christ could be conscious servant, the Buddha could be. So I often rephrase that by saying we can be unconscious slaves or willing servants. Because for me, to be a conscious servant is very high. Willing to do that can be a starting point. But we don't seem to realize how large the forces are. Again and again, I keep saying, I didn't create myself. I didn't create this breathing of breath. Who could disagree? But if we actually face this, even for a few minutes, we would see the large forces are at play. Even some people are born right from the very first day with a fair amount of intelligence, some not so much intelligence. Why? And then that allows them to have certain merit in the world or certain facilities in the world, and some others can't have them. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat. All this is not being designed by them. I mean, I think we can actually see that very large forces are at play in almost everything we are and everything we do in our life. Then this remark would make more sense. Either we are unconscious slaves of these large forces, or can be more and more willing servants.
So you're talking about the thing about being a willing servant, and my mind goes to you talking about Nash Karma. So that whole aspect of it is where you're acting, but you're not acting with egoistic intent.
Yes.
It's action without thought, as Krishnaji would say, correct?
It's action without one's own, if you like, selfish initiative. But that also requires some ability to hear what is called. And then willingness to actually be a little free of my achievement. But yes, the call very much is, how can I be an instrument? Nobody is suggesting not to do anything, but how can my action be carrying out something that is really coming from a different source, from a higher source? That's the reason Krishna's remark about that an exalted yogi realizes, I do nothing at all. And or when I quoted earlier from China, sage does nothing, but nothing is left undone. Really, the classic expression of that are those remarks of Christ that I just quoted. But of course, the reason why we quote these people are because one can find them in scriptures or great texts. But they are at a very high level. My impression is that there are many people at a considerably lower level, but in the right direction. But usually we don't find them in scriptures, etc., quite understandably. And therefore, sometimes it can actually be rather discouraging, because what is possible for Christ to do is not so easy for me to do. It might take possibly even many lifetimes, or even then, I don't know. So therefore, sometimes it becomes teachings of really great sages, but they have a feeling call to them. They call us, they touch something in us very deeply, but they're not so easy to follow in practice. So in practice, we need, if you like, intermediate teachers.
But do you feel that the fact that when it touches us deeply, just whether it's just for 3 seconds or 5 seconds, there is some change that
Yes.
does take
No, that is true. I agree. No, in fact, already even I have tried to say here that actually the first avenue to truth really is the feeling. Something is touched even though we may not quite understand what it is, or certainly not able to express it to somebody else. But one is touched by somebody's remarks or a piece of music or a sculpture that calls for something. It doesn't have to be in words.
I think what we're picking up on is something that you talked about, shared, pondered before, and that is that we're what calls us in the great ones all around us now who are fighting for truth and justice and making breakthroughs into the way we connect with each other and the land. It's sacrifice. It's individuals who have the willpower, even if it's imperfect and untidy, to sacrifice themselves for something greater. And it touches me not only for a moment. I ponder these people. One story heard in the morning of someone who is giving their lives for something important, that stays with me all day long. I go back to that and I think, how can they do that? Do I have that in me? Do I have that ability to fight for what I believe is true and how to do it? What the risks? Oh my goodness! I think I'm more inspired by the people around me all over the world whom I don't know, strangers, than I am sometimes by the words of sages.
Yeah. No, I think you also realize that something in you is touched by this. Same person or same writing or same description can be heard by 100 people. Not everybody is equally touched by this. Now, this is the reason I often say there are really two things we need to be clear about. One is the quality of the source. Who is saying it, from what quality they are saying. But it is also very important the quality of the receiver. Not everybody, this is the reason I give sometimes this, not a very nice example, but that every member of the mafia reads the same gospel as Meister Eckhart. So the gospel has the same quality, but the receivers are different. So in a way, not to underestimate your own, because you have been increasingly feeling something in some direction. So some of these writings or remarks of these people actually touch you. Why not? But I can guarantee the same thing may be heard or read by 100 people. Not equally everybody is touched by this. But it is also more and more emphasis, I think, required that the action is not to be undertaken by running away from the world, going to a monastery or equivalent part of it, just retiring from it. But on the other hand, I feel these two remarks of Christ are really worth putting them together seriously. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So the world requires something, some action is required. But also to keep in mind that his kingdom is not of this world. Both are required to understand what goes on in the usual world where we can act, but also to be free of the usual world. In a way, that's the attempt by going to a monastery. But I'm not suggesting that that is what we need to. That is forgetting about doing something in the world. Both are required. And then also very helpful to realize that each individual inevitably has to find something completely unique that is their action, their understanding. Not everybody needs to do the same thing. Not everybody needs to write music or do physics or to do meditation. No, each person needs to find what is their call and how they can respond to it in a way as a sort of a certain sense of service, really, for both sides. Because everybody shouldn't be just becoming a professor or everybody just becoming a musician. No, I don't think that is. Each person needs to find specifically how they can be truly themselves. And in every area, I mean, sometimes some of my friends say I am often so critical of what goes on in the academic world. That is true, but on the other hand, there are quite exceptional people in the academic world as well who are really spiritually oriented. Personally, for me, I have been a professor for almost 35 years. The 4 or 5 people who have really had the largest influence on me, ironically, in fact, I was saying this to a friend the other day, all of them are at least 30 to 35 years older than me. Largely because what happens at the same age group, people are often more competitive than anything else. People who are obviously highly regarded scholars, they're not any longer competing with anybody. They can look at something. Even, for example, my books, etc., the reviews by somebody like Houston Smith or Wilfred Cantwell Smith, highly regarded scholars, their reviews can be very, very appreciative. But particularly if you see a review done by an Indian scholar living outside India, they have to compete with each other for their place. So they're always very critical reviews. But it is understandable. I don't think it's something, because everybody is struggling to be exalted, to be regarded as high, etc. So one has to, personally, that has been at least my experience. Well, really 4 or 5 people I could happily name. One of them a physicist, one a philosopher, 2 or 3 professors in religion, all of them at least 30 years older than me, who actually were great help to me. And Walter Kaufman was another example at Princeton University. And, because they are not competing with us. So it's a very interesting thing to see what goes on in the world. Okay, unless somebody else wants to bring something, we'll just be quiet for a few moments and then we'll stop.